The morning of September 21, 2025, began like any other in the bustling province of Cebu, with vendors setting up their stalls in the early dawn light and jeepneys beginning their daily routes through the crowded streets. Children walked to school with their colorful backpacks, while office workers hurried to catch their rides to the city center. The tropical air carried the familiar sounds of a nation awakening: roosters crowing, motorcycle engines puttering, and the distant hum of conversation from neighborhood sari-sari stores. At exactly 8:47 a.m. Philippine Standard Time, the earth beneath the central Visayas region began to convulse with unprecedented violence. The 6.9 magnitude earthquake struck without warning, its epicenter located just 15 kilometers southeast of Cebu City. The initial tremor lasted 43 seconds that felt like an eternity to those experiencing the terrifying power of nature unleashed. Buildings throughout the region swayed dangerously as the seismic waves rippled outward from the fault line. Modern structures designed to withstand moderate earthquakes found themselves tested beyond their engineering limits, while older constructions, many built without proper seismic considerations, began to crumble under the relentless shaking. The sound was deafening, a combination of grinding concrete, shattering glass, and the deep, ominous rumble emanating from the earth itself. In Cebu City's financial district, office workers fled from high-rise buildings as windows exploded outward, sending shards of glass cascading onto the streets below. Traffic came to a complete standstill as drivers abandoned their vehicles and sought open spaces away from potential falling debris. The city's infrastructure, already strained by decades of rapid urbanization and questionable construction practices, began to reveal its vulnerabilities in the most catastrophic way possible. The earthquake's impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction of buildings and roads. In the mountainous regions surrounding Cebu, landslides triggered by the seismic activity buried entire barangays under tons of earth and rock. Coastal areas experienced localized tsunamis as the seafloor displacement sent waves crashing into harbors and fishing villages that had no early warning systems in place. Emergency services found themselves overwhelmed within minutes of the disaster. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology quickly confirmed the earthquake's magnitude and began issuing aftershock warnings, but communication networks had been severely damaged. Cell towers collapsed or lost power, leaving millions of residents unable to contact loved ones or receive critical information about evacuation procedures. Hospitals across the region struggled to cope with the sudden influx of casualties. Medical facilities that should have been earthquake-resistant revealed structural deficiencies that put both patients and staff at risk. Several medical centers had to be evacuated entirely, forcing emergency responders to set up triage areas in parking lots and open fields. The shortage of properly equipped emergency medical facilities became immediately apparent as the death toll began to climb. The international community responded swiftly to news of the disaster, with neighboring countries offering immediate assistance and rescue teams. However, the Philippines' disaster preparedness infrastructure proved inadequate for coordinating the massive relief effort required. Years of underfunding and mismanagement of emergency services became glaringly obvious as rescue operations struggled to reach remote areas where survivors remained trapped under debris. As the first day progressed and the full scope of the devastation became clear, questions began emerging about the government's preparedness for such disasters. Seismologists had long warned about the region's vulnerability to major earthquakes, citing the active fault systems that crisscross the archipelago. However, building codes remained poorly enforced, and many structures had been constructed using substandard materials or without proper geological surveys. The tragedy struck particularly hard in densely populated urban areas where rapid development had prioritized speed and profit over safety considerations. Informal settlements built on unstable slopes and reclaimed land suffered disproportionate damage, highlighting the intersection between poverty, corruption, and vulnerability to natural disasters. By nightfall on September 21st, preliminary casualty reports indicated that 69 people had lost their lives, with hundreds more injured and thousands displaced from their homes. The numbers would continue to rise as rescue teams reached more remote areas and the full extent of the destruction became apparent. What had begun as an ordinary Monday morning had transformed into one of the most devastating natural disasters in recent Philippine history. setting the stage for a national conversation about preparedness, corruption, and accountability that would soon capture the attention of the entire nation. 3 days after the devastating 6.9 magnitude earthquake that claimed 69 lives and left thousands homeless across Cebu province, Manny Pacquiao emerged from his private jet at Ninoy Aquino International Airport with a grim expression that reflected the weight of what he had witnessed. The boxing legend had spent the previous 48 hours touring the disaster zones, walking through collapsed buildings, visiting makeshift hospitals, and witnessing firsthand the suffering of his fellow Filipinos. The scenes that greeted Pacquiao in the affected areas painted a disturbing picture of systemic negligence and institutional failure. In Cebu City's downtown district, he observed how modern buildings constructed within the last decade had suffered catastrophic structural failures, while older colonial-era structures built with superior materials and craftsmanship remained largely intact. The contrast was stark and deeply troubling to someone who had dedicated his life to excellence and integrity. During his visits to evacuation centers, Pacquiao encountered families who had lost everything, not just to the earthquake itself, but to the cascading failures of a system that had failed to protect them. Survivors recounted how emergency services had been slow to respond, how rescue equipment was inadequate or non-functional, and how relief supplies were insufficient for the scale of the disaster. The stories of preventable deaths and unnecessary suffering began to crystallize into a pattern that pointed toward deeper institutional problems. The former senator's investigation into the disaster response revealed shocking deficiencies in the country's emergency preparedness infrastructure. Fire stations lacked proper rescue equipment, hospitals had been built without adequate seismic reinforcement, and evacuation routes were poorly planned or completely absent in many communities. Most disturbing of all were the reports of construction projects that had received government approval despite failing to meet basic safety standards. Pacquiao's team of advisors and disaster response experts compiled damning evidence of corruption within the construction and permitting processes. Building inspectors had apparently approved structures that used substandard materials, while safety certifications had been issued for projects that clearly violated seismic building codes. The paper trail revealed a web of bribes, kickbacks, and regulatory capture that had prioritized profits over public safety. The boxing champion's anger intensified as he learned about the misallocation of disaster preparedness funds over the previous decade. Billions of pesos designated for earthquake-resistant infrastructure improvements had been diverted to other projects or simply disappeared into the pockets of corrupt officials. Emergency response equipment that should have been strategically positioned throughout the region was either non-existent or in a state of disrepair due to lack of maintenance funding. International seismologists and disaster response experts who arrived to assist with the relief efforts privately confirmed Pacquiao's suspicions about the preventable nature of much of the destruction. Countries with similar seismic risks but better governance structures had successfully implemented building codes and emergency response systems that significantly reduced casualties during comparable earthquakes. The Philippines' failure to adopt these proven measures despite having the resources to do so pointed directly to corruption and mismanagement. The media began to take notice of Pacquiao's increasingly vocal criticism of the government's handling of both the disaster response and the underlying vulnerabilities that had made the earthquake so deadly. His status as a beloved national figure gave weight to his accusations, and his reputation for honesty and integrity made his claims difficult to dismiss. News outlets across the archipelago started investigating the construction and permitting irregularities that Pacquiao had highlighted. As the death toll continued to rise and more evidence of systemic corruption emerged, Pacquiao made the decision that would transform him from concerned citizen to political lightning rod. Standing among the rubble of a collapsed elementary school where 12 children had lost their lives, he prepared to make a statement that would send shockwaves through the Philippine political establishment and ignite a national conversation about accountability, corruption, and the true cost of governmental failure. The champion, who had spent his career fighting in boxing rings, was about to enter a different kind of arena, one where the stakes were measured not in championship belts, but in human lives and the future of Philippine democracy. His next words would mark the beginning of a confrontation that would reshape the country's political landscape. On September 25, 2025, exactly 4 days after the devastating earthquake, Manny Pacquiao stood before a gathering of national and international media at the ruins of the Cebu Provincial Hospital. The medical facility, which had partially collapsed during the tremor, served as a powerful backdrop for what would become one of the most controversial statements in Philippine political history. Behind him, rescue workers continued their grim task of searching for survivors among the twisted steel and concrete that had once housed the region's primary emergency medical center. The assembled journalists, disaster response officials, and concerned citizens fell silent as Pacquiao approached the makeshift podium. His usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by an expression of profound grief and righteous anger. The boxing legend's hands trembled slightly as he held the prepared statement, not from nervousness, but from the emotional weight of what he was about to reveal to the nation. Pacquiao's accusation sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd, and within minutes, across the entire archipelago, he directly blamed the Philippine government's systemic corruption for the earthquake's devastating death toll, arguing that the natural disaster had been transformed into a human tragedy through decades of institutional negligence and criminal mismanagement. His words cut through the typical political rhetoric with the precision of a championship boxer's knockout punch. The former senator presented a detailed indictment of the construction industry's corrupt practices, citing specific examples of buildings that had collapsed despite being certified as earthquake-resistant. He revealed evidence of safety inspectors who had accepted bribes to approve substandard construction materials, building permits issued for structures that violated seismic safety codes, and emergency response equipment that existed only on paper while the allocated funds disappeared into private accounts. Pacquiao's most damning revelation concerned the Cebu Provincial Hospital itself. According to documents his team had obtained, the medical facility had been constructed using concrete that failed to meet minimum strength requirements, with steel reinforcement bars that were below specification, and with a foundation design that ignored geological surveys warning about soil instability. The hospital had received full safety certification despite these critical deficiencies, a certification that cost the lives of medical staff and patients when the building partially collapsed. The boxing champion's statement extended beyond individual cases of corruption to address the systemic nature of the problem. He outlined how disaster preparedness funds had been systematically diverted over the past decade, leaving communities vulnerable to natural disasters that should have been survivable with proper infrastructure and emergency response capabilities. Early warning systems that could have saved lives were never installed, evacuation routes were never properly planned, and emergency shelters were never constructed despite repeated budget allocations for these purposes. International observers and disaster response experts who had arrived to assist with relief efforts found themselves inadvertently corroborating Pacquiao's accusations. Their assessments of the damage patterns and infrastructure failures aligned closely with his claims about corruption and negligence. Several foreign engineers privately expressed shock at the extent to which preventable factors had contributed to the disaster's severity. The immediate reaction to Pacquiao's statement was explosive and polarized. Government officials scrambled to respond to the accusations, with some dismissing them as politically motivated, while others called for immediate investigations. Social media platforms erupted with discussions about corruption, accountability, and the true cost of governmental failure. Citizens who had lost loved ones in the earthquake began sharing their own stories of systemic negligence and official indifference. Opposition politicians seized upon Pacquiao's statement as validation of their long-standing criticisms of the administration's governance. Civil society organizations that had been documenting corruption in the construction industry for years suddenly found their reports receiving national attention. International human rights groups began calling for independent investigations into the allegations. As news of Pacquiao's accusations spread beyond the Philippines, the international community began to scrutinize the country's disaster preparedness and governance structures more closely. The statement had transformed a natural disaster into a political crisis that would test the resilience of Philippine democratic institutions and the government's ability to address systemic corruption. Within hours of Manny Pacquiao's explosive accusations, the Philippine government machinery shifted into crisis management mode. Presidential communications teams worked frantically to craft responses that would counter the boxing legend's claims while avoiding further inflaming public sentiment. The administration found itself in the unprecedented position of defending against corruption allegations made by one of the country's most beloved and trusted public figures in the immediate aftermath of a national tragedy. The Office of the President issued the first official response late in the evening of September 25th, categorically denying Pacquiao's allegations and characterizing them as irresponsible and politically motivated. The statement emphasized the government's commitment to transparency and accountability, while asserting that all construction projects had followed proper procedures and safety protocols. Officials argued that the earthquake's devastating impact was due to the unprecedented magnitude of the natural disaster, rather than any systemic failures or corruption. Department of Public Works and Highways Secretary Maria Santos held an emergency press conference the following morning, presenting technical data and engineering reports that purportedly demonstrated the structural integrity of government-approved buildings. She displayed charts showing compliance rates with building codes and highlighted recent investments in disaster preparedness infrastructure. However, her presentation was repeatedly interrupted by journalists asking pointed questions about the specific cases Pacquiao had cited, creating an atmosphere of skepticism and tension. The Bureau of Building officials released a comprehensive statement defending their inspection and certification processes. They provided detailed documentation of safety protocols and quality control measures, emphasizing their adherence to international standards and best practices. The Bureau's director insisted that all collapsed buildings had been properly inspected and certified, suggesting that the earthquake's intensity had simply exceeded the design parameters of the structures. Government allies in Congress rallied to support the administration's position, organizing press conferences and issuing statements that questioned Pacquiao's expertise in engineering and disaster management. Several lawmakers suggested that the former boxer was exploiting a national tragedy for political gain, pointing to his previous senatorial campaign and rumored presidential ambitions. They argued that his accusations were undermining national unity during a time when the country needed to focus on relief and recovery efforts. The administration's strategy included highlighting their disaster response achievements and ongoing relief operations. Officials showcased the rapid deployment of emergency services, the establishment of evacuation centers, and the coordination with international aid organizations. They presented statistics demonstrating the government's swift response time and the resources allocated to affected communities, attempting to shift the narrative from prevention failures to response successes. However, the government's defensive posture began to show cracks as independent investigations by journalists and civil society organizations started uncovering evidence that supported Pacquiao's claims. Documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests revealed discrepancies between official safety certifications and actual construction practices. Whistleblowers within government agencies began coming forward with testimonies about pressure to approve substandard projects and the systematic overlooking of safety violations. The international community's response further complicated the government's position. Foreign disaster response experts who had arrived to assist with relief efforts began making observations that aligned with Pacquiao's accusations. Their technical assessments of the damage patterns and infrastructure failures provided credible support for claims about preventable factors contributing to the disaster's severity. As public pressure mounted and evidence continued to emerge, the government found itself increasingly isolated in its denials. The administration's credibility suffered as citizens compared official statements with the reality they witnessed in affected communities. The defensive response that was intended to contain the crisis instead amplified it, transforming Pacquiao's accusations into a national conversation about governance, accountability, and the relationship between corruption and public safety. The digital landscape of the Philippines erupted into a virtual battlefield within hours of Manny Pacquiao's earthquake corruption allegations. Social media platforms became the primary arena where millions of Filipinos expressed their outrage, shared personal experiences, and demanded accountability from their government. The hashtag #earthquakecorruption began trending globally, transforming a local disaster into an international symbol of governmental failure and systemic negligence. Facebook groups dedicated to earthquake relief efforts suddenly shifted their focus from coordinating aid to documenting evidence of corruption and construction irregularities. Citizens posted photographs of collapsed buildings alongside images of their original construction permits and safety certifications, creating a crowdsourced investigation that revealed widespread discrepancies between official approvals and actual building quality. These grassroots documentation efforts provided compelling visual evidence that supported Pacquiao's accusations. Twitter became a platform for real-time testimony from earthquake survivors and their families. Heart-wrenching accounts emerged of preventable deaths, with relatives describing how their loved ones had died in buildings that were supposed to be earthquake-resistant. Construction workers came forward anonymously to share stories about being forced to use substandard materials, while official inspectors looked the other way. These personal narratives gave human faces to the abstract concept of corruption, making the issue emotionally resonant for millions of Filipinos. The viral spread of corruption-related content overwhelmed government attempts to control the narrative. Official social media accounts that tried to defend the administration's record were flooded with comments from citizens sharing contradictory evidence and personal experiences. Government spokespersons found their carefully crafted messages drowned out by the authentic voices of affected communities, creating a stark contrast between official rhetoric and lived reality. YouTube channels dedicated to investigative journalism experienced unprecedented viewership as content creators began producing detailed analyses of construction corruption in the Philippines. These videos combined Pacquiao's allegations with historical data about building failures, creating comprehensive exposés that reached audiences far beyond traditional news media. The platform's algorithm amplified corruption-related content, ensuring that discussions about governmental accountability dominated online discourse. International social media users began sharing and commenting on Filipino content, bringing global attention to the corruption allegations. Overseas Filipino workers used their platforms to amplify the voices of their compatriots back home, creating a worldwide network of support for accountability efforts. International human rights organizations and anti-corruption groups began monitoring the situation, adding their voices to calls for independent investigations. The government's attempts to counter the social media narrative proved largely ineffective. Official accounts that posted defensive content received overwhelmingly negative responses, with citizens providing specific examples that contradicted government claims. Paid social media campaigns designed to shift public opinion were quickly identified and exposed by vigilant users, further damaging the administration's credibility and generating additional outrage about the misuse of public funds for propaganda purposes. Religious leaders and civil society organizations began using their social media platforms to call for prayer, reflection, and action regarding corruption issues. Catholic bishops shared posts about the moral imperative to fight corruption, while Protestant pastors organized online prayer sessions for earthquake victims and accountability for government officials. These religious voices added moral authority to the growing movement for transparency and reform. The social media storm created unprecedented pressure for traditional news outlets to intensify their coverage of corruption allegations. Journalists found themselves competing with citizen reporters who were breaking stories and uncovering evidence through social media platforms. The democratization of information sharing through digital platforms had fundamentally altered the dynamics of political accountability, giving ordinary citizens unprecedented power to challenge official narratives and demand answers from their government. As the online movement gained momentum, it became clear that the digital revolution had created new possibilities for civic engagement and political pressure that would reshape Philippine democracy. The mounting public pressure and international attention following Manny Pacquiao's corruption allegations prompted several independent organizations to launch comprehensive investigations into the earthquake's preventable causes. The Commission on Audit, responding to widespread demands for transparency, announced a special investigation into construction contracts and safety certifications issued in the Cebu region over the past decade. This marked the first time in recent Philippine history that such a high-profile disaster had triggered immediate accountability measures. International engineering firms, volunteering their expertise for disaster relief efforts, began conducting unofficial assessments of the structural failures they observed. These foreign experts, unencumbered by local political considerations, provided technical analyses that largely corroborated Pacquiao's claims about substandard construction practices. Their preliminary reports identified systematic violations of seismic building codes, use of inferior materials, and design flaws that should have been caught during routine inspections. The Philippine Institute of Civil Engineers, initially reluctant to wade into political controversy, found itself compelled to address the technical aspects of Pacquiao's allegations. The organization formed an emergency committee to review building failures and assess whether proper engineering standards had been followed. Their investigation revealed disturbing patterns of approved projects that deviated significantly from submitted plans, suggesting widespread corruption in the oversight process. Investigative journalists from major news organizations began collaborating on an unprecedented scale to examine construction corruption across the archipelago. Teams of reporters gained access to government documents through Freedom of Information requests, interviewed construction workers and safety inspectors, and analyzed financial records of companies involved in public works projects. Their findings painted a picture of systemic corruption that extended far beyond the earthquake-affected areas. The Department of Justice, facing intense public scrutiny, announced the formation of a special task force to investigate potential criminal violations related to construction corruption. The task force was granted broad powers to subpoena documents, interview witnesses, and coordinate with other government agencies. However, public skepticism about the government investigating itself led to demands for international oversight and independent monitoring of the process. Civil society organizations that had been documenting corruption for years suddenly found their research in high demand. Anti-corruption groups provided investigators with extensive databases of questionable construction projects, suspicious permit approvals, and financial irregularities they had been tracking. These organizations became crucial sources of institutional knowledge about corruption patterns that had previously been ignored by mainstream media and government officials. International transparency organizations began examining the Philippine case as part of broader studies on corruption and disaster vulnerability. Transparency International announced plans to include the earthquake response in their annual Corruption Perceptions Index, while the World Bank indicated that the allegations could affect future infrastructure lending decisions. These international implications added urgency to domestic accountability efforts. The Senate, responding to public pressure, announced plans for comprehensive hearings on construction corruption and disaster preparedness. Opposition senators who had previously struggled to gain attention for anti-corruption initiatives suddenly found themselves at the center of national attention. The hearings promised to provide a public forum for examining evidence and questioning government officials under oath. University researchers and academic institutions began studying the earthquake as a case study in the intersection of corruption and disaster vulnerability. These scholarly investigations provided additional analytical frameworks for understanding how systemic corruption had contributed to the disaster's severity. Academic conferences and research papers began examining the Philippine case as an example of how governance failures can amplify natural disasters. As multiple investigations proceeded simultaneously, a complex picture began emerging of how decades of corruption had created vulnerabilities that transformed a natural disaster into a preventable tragedy. The convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources strengthened the credibility of Pacquiao's original allegations and created momentum for comprehensive reforms to prevent similar disasters in the future. As independent investigations gained momentum throughout early October 2025, a devastating array of evidence began surfacing that validated Manny Pacquiao's explosive allegations about government corruption contributing to the earthquake's deadly toll. The first major breakthrough came when a former Department of Public Works and Highways engineer, protected by whistleblower legislation, provided investigators with thousands of internal documents that exposed systematic falsification of safety inspections and material quality certifications. The leaked documents revealed a sophisticated corruption network that had operated for over a decade across multiple government agencies. Construction companies routinely submitted building plans that met safety standards to obtain permits, then executed projects using inferior materials and modified designs that compromised structural integrity. Safety inspectors, receiving regular payments from contractors, would certify these substandard buildings as earthquake-resistant without conducting proper evaluations. Forensic accountants working with the Commission on Audit uncovered financial trails that demonstrated how disaster preparedness funds had been systematically diverted to private accounts. Over 2.8 billion pesos allocated for seismic retrofitting of public buildings had been distributed among shell companies owned by relatives of government officials. Emergency response equipment purchases existed only on paper, with the allocated funds disappearing through fraudulent invoicing schemes that inflated costs by up to 400%. International engineering teams conducting structural assessments of collapsed buildings discovered concrete samples that contained dangerous levels of sand and insufficient cement, creating materials that crumbled under seismic stress. Steel reinforcement bars recovered from the rubble tested significantly below required strength specifications, with some samples showing evidence of recycled materials that had been weakened through previous use. These findings provided irrefutable technical proof that construction standards had been deliberately compromised. The investigation into the collapsed Cebu Provincial Hospital revealed particularly damning evidence of criminal negligence. Geological surveys conducted before construction had explicitly warned against building on the selected site due to soil liquefaction risks during earthquakes. However, these warnings had been ignored, and the construction proceeded using a foundation design completely inappropriate for the geological conditions. The hospital's structural engineer later admitted under oath that he had been pressured to approve the inadequate design by government officials who had already committed to the location for political reasons. Bank records obtained through court orders exposed the financial mechanisms used to facilitate construction corruption. Offshore accounts in Singapore and Hong Kong had received millions of dollars in payments from Philippine construction companies, with the funds subsequently transferred to accounts controlled by government officials and their families. These financial flows coincided precisely with the approval of major infrastructure projects that later failed catastrophically during the earthquake. Testimony from construction workers provided ground-level evidence of how corruption operated in practice. Workers described being instructed to use cheaper materials than specified in approved plans, to skip critical safety procedures, and to falsify quality control documentation. Supervisors who attempted to maintain proper standards were removed from projects, while those who cooperated with cost-cutting measures received bonuses and preferential treatment for future contracts. The investigation uncovered evidence that international safety consultants hired to review Philippine construction standards had submitted reports identifying critical vulnerabilities in building codes and enforcement mechanisms. These reports, dating back to 2018, had recommended comprehensive reforms to prevent exactly the type of disaster that occurred during the earthquake. However, the recommendations had been buried in bureaucratic processes and never implemented, apparently because they would have disrupted profitable corruption schemes. Digital forensics experts analyzing government computer systems discovered evidence of systematic deletion of safety inspection records and quality control documentation in the weeks following the earthquake. Email communications between government officials revealed coordination efforts to destroy evidence and align their stories before facing public scrutiny. These cover-up attempts provided additional proof of consciousness of guilt among those responsible for construction oversight. As the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that the earthquake had exposed a corruption network of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The systematic nature of the violations and the extensive documentation of criminal activity created an overwhelming case for comprehensive accountability measures and fundamental reforms to prevent future disasters. The overwhelming evidence of construction corruption, revealed through independent investigations, sent shockwaves through the Philippine political establishment, triggering the most significant governmental crisis in decades. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s administration found itself facing unprecedented pressure as opposition parties, civil society groups, and international observers demanded immediate accountability for the systemic failures that had contributed to the earthquake's devastating death toll. The Senate's emergency hearings on construction corruption became a national spectacle, broadcast live across multiple television networks and streaming platforms. Opposition senators seized the opportunity to grill government officials under oath, presenting the damning evidence that had emerged from various investigations. The hearings revealed a web of complicity that extended from local building inspectors to cabinet-level officials, implicating dozens of high-ranking government figures in the corruption network. Several key government officials attempted to distance themselves from the scandal by submitting resignation letters, hoping to avoid criminal prosecution. The Secretary of Public Works and Highways became the first cabinet member to step down, followed by the head of the Bureau of Building Officials and 3 regional directors responsible for construction oversight in earthquake-affected areas. However, these resignations were widely viewed as inadequate responses to the scope of the corruption that had been exposed. Opposition political parties, energized by the public outrage and clear evidence of governmental failure, began organizing coordinated efforts to capitalize on the crisis. The Liberal Party and other opposition groups formed a united front demanding comprehensive investigations, criminal prosecutions, and constitutional reforms to prevent future corruption. They positioned themselves as champions of accountability and transparency, contrasting their stance with the administration's defensive responses. Manny Pacquiao's role evolved from whistleblower to potential political kingmaker, as various opposition groups courted his support and endorsement. Political analysts speculated about his possible return to electoral politics, with some suggesting he could emerge as a unifying figure for anti-corruption forces. His continued criticism of the government and calls for systemic reform resonated with millions of Filipinos who viewed him as an authentic voice for change. The ruling party's congressional supermajority began showing signs of fracture, as some members distanced themselves from the administration's handling of the crisis. Regional politicians whose constituencies had been affected by the earthquake faced intense pressure from their constituents to support accountability measures. Several pro-administration congressmen publicly called for independent investigations and criminal prosecutions, breaking ranks with party leadership. International diplomatic pressure intensified as foreign governments and multilateral organizations expressed concern about corruption in Philippine infrastructure projects. The United States Congress held hearings examining American aid programs to the Philippines, while the European Union indicated that trade relationships could be affected by the corruption revelations. These international implications added urgency to domestic political calculations. The Catholic Church, traditionally influential in Philippine politics, issued pastoral letters condemning corruption and calling for moral renewal in government. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle's statement, linking the earthquake deaths to moral failures in governance, resonated deeply with the predominantly Catholic population. Religious leaders organized prayer rallies that doubled as anti-corruption demonstrations, adding spiritual authority to political demands for accountability. Public opinion polls showed dramatic shifts in political support, with the administration's approval ratings plummeting to historic lows. Trust in government institutions reached crisis levels as citizens expressed widespread skepticism about official statements and promises of reform. The political landscape appeared to be undergoing fundamental realignment as traditional party loyalties gave way to demands for accountability and transparency. As the political crisis deepened, speculation grew about potential constitutional mechanisms for addressing governmental failure, including impeachment proceedings and early elections. The earthquake had transformed from a natural disaster into a political earthquake that threatened to reshape Philippine democracy and governance structures for years to come.